All right, so this news coming in just about half an hour ago. The International Court of Justice has ruled that Russia must get out of Ukraine. The court says Russia must immediately stop military operations and withdraw its troops.
The court also ruled both parties must refrain from aggravating the dispute. The ICJ says it does have jurisdiction over the matter and could make a decision even though Russia elected not to represent itself at the court. The provisional measures are binding on both parties. Take a listen.
The court considers that the Russian Federation must also ensure that any military or irregular armed units which may be directed or supported by it, as well as any organizations and persons which may be subject to its control and direction, take no steps in furtherance of those military operations. The court recalls that Ukraine also requested it to indicate measures aimed at ensuring the non-aggravation of the dispute with the Russian Federation. When it indicates provisional measures for the purpose of preserving specific rights, the court may also indicate provisional measures with a view to preventing the aggravation or extension of the dispute if it considers that those circumstances so require. In the present case, having considered all the circumstances, in addition to the specific measures it has decided to order, the court deems it necessary to indicate an additional measure directed at both parties and aimed at ensuring the non-aggravation of the dispute. In the present case, having considered the terms of the provisional measures requested by Ukraine and the circumstances of the case, the court finds that the measures to be indicated need not be identical to those requested. The court considers that, with regard to the situation described above, the Russian Federation must, pending the final decision in the case, suspend the military operations that it commenced on 24 February 2022 in the territory of Ukraine. In addition, recalling the statement of the permanent representative of the Russian Federation to the United Nations that the, I quote, Donetsk People's Republic and the Lugansk People's Republic, end of quotation, had turned to the Russian Federation with a request to grant military support. The court considers that the Russian Federation must also ensure that any military or irregular armed units which may be directed or supported by it, as well as any organizations and persons which may be subject to its control and direction, take no steps in furtherance of those military operations.
Well, public law expert Professor Cathleen Powell joins us now for more on this story. So, Cathleen, lots of technical terms given about how the International Court of Justice actually came to this decision. So break it down for us.
Hello, Shahan. Yes, thank you. The International Court of Justice does not automatically have jurisdiction to hear any cases. It has jurisdiction only through consent. So states consent to the jurisdiction of the court, and they usually limit their consent to specific topics or specific issues. Now, what's happened here is that the document that Ukraine is relying on to show that Russia has consented to the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice is the Genocide Convention. So, strictly speaking, Ukraine has not brought an application to the court to say Russia has invaded us, tell them to go away. Ukraine has brought an application to the court saying Russia has invaded us on the basis, it says, that we are committing genocide. So we have a dispute about what the Genocide Convention means because we don't think we're committing genocide. And because the conflict is linked to the dispute, the military conflict is linked to the dispute under the Genocide Convention, said Ukraine, you, the court, have jurisdiction over this matter. And that is an argument that the court accepted in a preliminary fashion. It said it doesn't have to make the final decision on jurisdiction at this point. What it has to do, and it did, was determine that it has enough jurisdiction at least to order interim measures. So the interim order is while we decide whether we have jurisdiction and while we decide what the merits of this case are, what the actual meaning of genocide is under the convention and whether Ukraine is committing it, while we decide that, the military action must stop. So it was actually a clever legal argument made by Ukraine to bring a matter before the court that one would not have expected to end up before the ICJ, which was Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
All right, let's talk about how binding this provisional ruling is on Russia? Because we know that Vladimir Putin doesn't always stick to the rules, despite Russia obviously signing the Genocide Convention.
You are right to be nervous. Russia, in fact, didn't even pitch for the legal argument before the ICJ, although they did send a note saying that the court did not have jurisdiction because this conflict had nothing to do with the Genocide Convention. So yes, Russia is not very cooperative. In fact, in the history of the ICJ, generally when a provisional measures order is handed down, so an order like they've done today, about conflict, when an interim order is made that a party has to withdraw from a conflict situation, it's generally ignored. Now, that doesn't mean that the ICJ ruling today is useless. It adds significantly to the pressure that Russia is under. It explains significantly legally who is in a stronger position, but it's not necessarily going to be heeded by Russia at all. In fact, I can pretty much guarantee that it won't be.
Are there any consequences to that?
Well, yes. Russia, first of all, legally speaking, technically, the provisional measures are binding. The court has held so in a previous case. So by not holding to them, Russia has committed an international tort, or it is responsible for that. And at some later stage, it could be held responsible for the various for these various transgressions. You need to get into a position where you actually have some power over Russia in order to insist that, for example, Russia pays some form of reparations to Ukraine, for one thing. Now, that's going to take some time. I've had lots of people saying that, international law isn't law because, look, people can just break it. But the point is that it moves more slowly because we don't have a central judiciary that's binding on everybody, and we don't have a central executive that can step in and stop this. In fact, in this case, it's Russia that's stopping the executive from acting. We don't have that, but you will find that over time, the consequences for breaching the law do end up being very costly. The USA discovered that when it invaded Iraq in 2003. It took a while, but it paid the cost. And what Russia's done now by ignoring the ruling, or will be doing when it ignores the ruling, is adding to the cost for itself of invading Ukraine. And hopefully this ICJ ruling helps to strengthen international law for the future.
Does this ruling have any impact on the talks that are currently being held between Ukraine and Russia going forward, do you think?
Yes, they strengthened Ukraine's hand. Ukraine can say, look, you guys are now actually in breach of a binding International Court of Justice ruling. And we don't know how they're talking to one another at these negotiations, but both states will want to assemble the strongest arguments that they can, both moral and practical. I mean, Russia has been trying to assemble moral arguments claiming there's genocide against people in certain regions in East Ukraine, and claiming that it's being threatened somehow. But morally, it's actually very, very weak. And this step strengthens the moral arguments that Ukraine can bring to the negotiation, moral and legal. And that is going to be part of the tipping point for the two states.
And, just to bring it back home, we had the Deputy President of South Africa telling the National Council of Provinces today that ultimately Russia has invaded Ukraine because of NATO indecisions, basically edging closer towards Russia. It somewhat justified the war that we're seeing. Does this ruling as well have any impact on how international countries actually issue statements, etc., on the position regarding Ukraine? Because South Africa is being seen as neutral in this matter, but we don't always see that when people actually speak publicly.
Yes, two things. First of all, the reasons that Russia might have for invading Ukraine are not legal justifications. Its only legal justification would be if Ukraine actually carried out an armed attack on Russia, which it did not. So what the South African government is doing is coming up with what in fact should be factors in mitigation and presenting them as though they make Russia not guilty of an invasion. And that's a very dangerous fudging of the legal position. I don't think, however, that the ICJ decision today is going to make any difference on that question of whether the invasion is unlawful. Because remember, the case that Ukraine brought to the ICJ was, what does the Genocide Convention mean? And it's actually, I'll have to check exactly how the ICJ made this argument, but it's quite a surprising reach for it to say, because there's conflict on what the Genocide Convention means, we are going to tell Russia to withdraw its troops. And it does make clear how terrible the armed conflict is and what suffering has been caused, but it doesn't in fact speak on whether Russia has invaded Ukraine, because that is not the case that was brought to it.
Got you. Thank you so much for your insight. Appreciate it. Public law expert, Professor Cathleen Powell.